At our 10th anniversary dinner, my husband stood up with champagne in hand and introduced his mistress to our closest friends, announcing they were in love. She sat beside him in a designer dress I'd never seen, smiling like she'd won a prize. He slid divorce papers across the table while everyone watched, expecting me to crumble, but what he didn't know was that the prenup he'd forgotten about was about to destroy everything he'd built. The private dining room at Mercantile, San Francisco's most exclusive steakhouse where reservations required 3 months' notice and entrees started at $75. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Fell silent when my husband Nathaniel raised his crystal champagne flute. The room was exactly as he'd requested, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, a single long table dressed in ivory linen, candlelight reflecting off polished silverware that probably cost more per place setting than most people's monthly car payments. I watched him stand at the head of that table, wearing the custom Tom Ford suit I'd bought him for his 40th birthday 2 years ago, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment he'd been planning. His business partner Garrett sat to his right, already smirking like he was in on the joke. Garrett's wife Simone picked at her appetizer with studied disinterest, the kind of calculated indifference wealthy women perfected when they wanted to appear above the drama they'd helped orchestrate. Nathaniel's younger sister Vivian had positioned herself directly across from me, phone already in hand, angled for optimal recording. But the person who made rage crystallize into something cold and hard in my chest sat directly beside my husband, in the chair that should have been empty out of respect for the marriage we were supposedly celebrating. Lorelei Ashford. 28 years old. Nathaniel's executive vice president of client relations, at the commercial real estate development firm he'd built over 15 years. She wore a form-fitting black dress with a neckline that left nothing to professional imagination, and around her throat hung my grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones that had been in my family for 4 generations, the ones Nathaniel had borrowed 6 months ago claiming he wanted to have them appraised for insurance purposes. "I want to propose a toast," Nathaniel announced, his voice carrying that practiced confidence he used during pitch meetings with investors. "To new chapters and to living authentically." Garrett lifted his glass immediately, the movements synchronized like they'd rehearsed this performance. Simone followed with a soft titter that sounded like wind chimes made of calculated cruelty. Vivian actually giggled, her phone never wavering from its position capturing my face for whatever group chat would dissect this moment later. Nathaniel reached into his leather messenger bag, the one I'd given him when his company closed its first major deal 7 years ago, and extracted a manila envelope embossed with a law firm's name I didn't recognize. He slid it across the table toward me with theatrical precision, the envelope making a soft whisper against the linen that somehow felt louder than it should have. "Happy anniversary, Victoria," he said, and the satisfaction in his voice was so thick I could taste it like smoke. "I thought we should mark this milestone honestly." I picked up the envelope and opened it slowly, aware that 6 people at this table were watching my face, waiting for tears or anger or the desperate begging that would validate whatever narrative Nathaniel had constructed about our failed marriage. Inside were divorce papers, professionally prepared and already filled out, with sticky notes marking where my signature was required. The terms were breathtaking in their audacity: 50-50 split of all assets including my family's property, immediate transfer of our Pacific Heights home to Nathaniel's sole ownership, and a waiver of any spousal support despite the fact that I'd supported his business dreams for a decade while sacrificing my own career. They wanted me to break. They wanted to watch me fall apart in front of witnesses who could testify later that I'd been unstable, emotional, unreasonable, all the words men use to dismiss women who refuse to accept betrayal quietly. Instead, I pulled my pen from my clutch and began signing every page while they watched in confused silence. Because what none of them knew, what Nathaniel had apparently forgotten in his arrogance and careful planning, was that 10 years ago, before we married, his father had insisted on a prenuptial agreement that Nathaniel had signed without reading carefully because he'd been too in love and too confident that our marriage would last forever. That prenup was about to remind him that overconfidence is expensive, and that the wife he'd underestimated had spent 9 months preparing for this exact moment with lawyers who didn't lose and evidence that would cost him everything he'd built while I watched. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up at that table signing divorce papers while my husband's mistress wore my grandmother's pearls like trophies she'd earned, you need to understand what came before. You need to know about the marriage I thought I had, the life I believed we were building together, and the exact moment 10 years ago when Nathaniel's father made a decision that would eventually save me from complete destruction. I met Nathaniel Hartwick 11 years ago at a charity gala for the San Francisco Arts Foundation. I was there representing my family's philanthropic foundation, the Pemberton Trust, established by my grandfather in 1962 after he sold his shipping company for what would be worth about $200 million in today's money. My parents had continued the tradition of strategic philanthropy, and by the time I was 28, I'd taken over managing the foundation's investments and grant distributions. Nathaniel showed up as a guest of one of the corporate sponsors, talking about urban development and sustainable architecture with enough genuine passion that people gathered around him like he was discussing treasure maps instead of zoning permits and LEED certifications. He was 32 then, running a small commercial real estate development firm he'd started 3 years earlier with money borrowed from his father and a business plan he'd written on weekends while working 80-hour weeks at a larger firm. He found me near the silent auction tables, looking at a photograph collection some local artist had donated, and asked intelligent questions about the foundation's work that made me feel seen in ways I hadn't experienced before. Most men I dated either found philanthropy boring or felt threatened by a woman whose family name appeared on museum wings and hospital buildings. Nathaniel seemed different. He listened when I spoke. He asked follow-up questions. He treated my work like it mattered beyond the money it represented. We dated for 14 months before he proposed on the observation deck at Coit Tower during a private evening he'd arranged through connections I didn't know he had. He'd hired a violinist and a photographer, ordered champagne that cost more than his monthly rent, and gotten down on one knee with a vintage Cartier ring he'd saved for 6 months to buy. The ring wasn't the most expensive piece of jewelry I owned. My family's collection included pieces that belonged in museums, but it was thoughtful. It represented sacrifice and planning and genuine love, or at least what I believed was genuine love at the time. His father, Edmund Hartwick, called me to lunch 2 weeks after Nathaniel proposed. Edmund was old San Francisco money that had survived 3 generations through careful management and strategic marriages. He'd built his own commercial real estate empire in the 70s and 80s, and he had opinions about protecting family assets that didn't include romance or sentiment. We met at his club, the kind of establishment where memberships passed through families and women were only recently allowed beyond the dining room, and he was direct in ways that should have offended me but somehow didn't. He liked me, he said, thought I was intelligent and capable, probably too good for his son if he was being honest. But he'd seen too many marriages dissolve and too many family businesses destroyed in divorce courts, and he wanted protections in place before Nathaniel and I married. A prenuptial agreement. Standard protections for both sides, he assured me. His lawyer had drafted something fair that would protect the Hartwick family business while also protecting my family's trust and assets. We'd each keep what we brought into the marriage. Any business built during the marriage using family resources would remain with the family who provided those resources. Standard terms that any reasonable person would accept. I signed it after my own lawyers reviewed it and confirmed it was actually more favorable to me than standard California community property law would have been. The Pemberton Trust remained entirely mine. Any inheritance I received stayed separate. And critically, though I didn't understand its significance at the time, any business built primarily with my family's financial support would be considered my separate property, not marital assets subject to division. Nathaniel signed it too, barely glancing at the 47 pages of legal language because he was too excited about our wedding and too confident that we'd never need these protections anyway. He joked that his father was paranoid, that we'd be married 50 years and die holding hands like people in romantic movies. I wanted to believe him. I did believe him. Our wedding was elegant but not ostentatious, held at my family's estate in Woodside with 200 guests who represented the intersection of old money and new ambition. Nathaniel's mother cried during the ceremony. Edmund gave a toast about building legacies that last. My father welcomed Nathaniel into our family with genuine warmth that came from believing he'd found someone who loved his daughter for herself rather than her last name. My grandmother gave me her pearl earrings that day, the ones that had belonged to her grandmother, brought over from England in 1891 when my family first came to California. For generations of Pemberton women had worn them at their weddings and passed them down with stories about survival and resilience and refusing to be broken by men or circumstances. I wore them throughout our wedding day, feeling their weight against my neck like a promise that I came from women who endured. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 8 years, that's what I believed we had. Nathaniel's development firm grew from 3 employees working out of a converted warehouse space to 47 people occupying an entire floor in the financial district. His projects transformed neighborhoods, converting old industrial buildings into mixed-use developments with retail spaces, offices, and luxury condos that actually improved communities instead of destroying them. I was proud of what he built, proud of the man he'd become. What I didn't let myself acknowledge was how much of that growth came from my family's resources. The Pemberton Trust provided seed funding for his first major project, a $6 million investment that Edmund couldn't or wouldn't provide. My connections opened doors to investors and city officials who might not have taken meetings with a relatively unknown developer. My family's reputation gave him credibility he hadn't entirely earned yet. I told myself we were partners, that marriages meant supporting each other's dreams, that my contributions were investments in our shared future. Then about 9 months before that anniversary dinner at Mercantile, Nathaniel started changing in ways I noticed but refused to name. He began working later, coming home after 10 or 11 at night with explanations about difficult clients and project deadlines that sounded plausible enough. His firm was competing for a massive contract to develop the waterfront area south of the ballpark, a project that could define his career, he said. I understood demanding careers because managing the Pemberton Trust required long hours too. So I didn't question the late nights or the weekend trips to Los Angeles and Seattle to meet with potential investors. He hired a celebrity personal trainer and started working out at 5 in the morning, 6 days a week. His body transformed, becoming leaner and more defined, the kind of physique that required obsessive dedication and probably pharmaceutical assistance he never admitted to. He started buying clothes I'd never seen before, designer labels that cost more than our monthly household expenses. Brunello Cucinelli suits. Tom Ford everything. Watches that cost $15,000 each. When I commented on the spending, he explained that his firm's success required a certain image, that clients expected developers to look successful before they'd trust them with $100 million projects. It made sense in a way that allowed me to ignore the growing discomfort. Our intimate life didn't disappear suddenly, it eroded so gradually I didn't realize it was gone until months had passed without any real physical connection. When I tried to initiate something more than perfunctory goodnight kisses, Nathaniel had excuses that sounded reasonable individually but added up to a pattern I was determined not to see. He was exhausted from the waterfront project. He was stressed about the investor presentation. He had early morning meetings and needed sleep. He'd started suggesting I was being demanding when I asked if something was wrong between us, turning my concerns into character flaws that made me question whether I was creating problems that didn't exist. I suggested couples therapy once and he looked at me like I'd proposed something deeply insulting. "We're fine, Victoria," he said with the patient tone people use when explaining obvious things to children. "You're just used to having all my attention, and now I'm building something important. Can't you be supportive instead of needy?" So I stopped asking. I stopped initiating. I became smaller and quieter in my own home because some part of me understood that pushing would force an answer I wasn't ready to hear. Instead, I focused on the foundation's work, approving grants and meeting with nonprofit directors and maintaining the illusion that everything in my personal life was perfectly fine. My best friend Cassandra saw what I refused to acknowledge. We'd known each other since boarding school at Thatcher, survived college roommate drama at Stanford, and stood beside each other through family deaths and career crises and everything else that bonds women who actually see each other clearly. She came to our house one Saturday when Nathaniel was supposedly at the office, and we sat on the terrace overlooking the bay with wine that cost more than it should have. "Are you happy?" Cassandra asked carefully, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer but wanted to hear me say it out loud. I bristled immediately, defensive in ways that proved she'd touched something true. "We're fine," I insisted. "Just busy with work. That's normal for people our age building careers." Cassandra didn't push, just squeezed my hand and said she was there whenever I needed her. After she left, the house felt too quiet. I wandered through rooms that suddenly looked like a museum exhibit of someone else's life, Nathaniel's preferred furniture, his choice of artwork, his schedule determining when we ate and slept and existed together. The cold recognition settled in my stomach like a stone. 3 weeks before our 10th anniversary, Nathaniel sent me a text message while I was reviewing grant applications at the foundation's offices downtown. He'd made reservations at Mercantile for Friday night to celebrate, complete with a champagne emoji that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Nathaniel hadn't initiated a celebration in over 18 months. The sudden enthusiasm felt manufactured, performative, like he was following a script rather than expressing genuine affection. I texted back a heart emoji because I didn't know what else to say, then stared at my computer screen without seeing the nonprofit proposals in front of me. Something was coming, and I was finally ready to stop pretending I didn't know it. That Tuesday morning arrived with fog rolling across the bay. I woke at 6 to prepare for a board meeting, and Nathaniel had already left for his morning workout. His MacBook sat open on the kitchen island where he'd apparently been working the night before. The screen was dark but still logged in, based on the small light glowing on the power button. I wasn't planning to look at it. I had no reason to distrust Nathaniel beyond vague unease and Cassandra's concern. I reached past the laptop for my coffee mug and my elbow brushed the trackpad. The screen illuminated instantly, displaying his email inbox. A notification banner appeared at the top, new message from Lorelei Ashford. Subject line, last night was everything. When can I see you again? My hand froze. Lorelei Ashford was Nathaniel's executive vice president of client relations. I'd met her once at the firm's holiday party 8 months earlier, a woman in her late 20s who laughed too loudly at Nathaniel's jokes and touched his arm when she talked. The email preview showed the first line, I can't stop thinking about your hands on me. The hotel room. Everything. I clicked before my rational mind could stop me. The message opened, and with it an entire archive of correspondence that had been happening in parallel to my marriage for nearly 10 months. Hundreds of emails with subject lines that told their own story. Portland hotel confirmation, this weekend can't come fast enough, our future together. The kitchen chair scraped against the floor as I sat down, my legs no longer reliable. I opened the first thread, dated 11 months earlier, and started reading with the careful focus I usually reserved for trust documents and investment prospectuses. They discussed Nathaniel's unhappy marriage to a wife who was more interested in her family's foundation than in being a real partner. Lorelei wrote about how accomplished and visionary he was, deserving of someone who actually appreciated him. They planned weekend trips to Napa and Carmel under the guise of client meetings. The most recent emails discussed Friday's anniversary dinner at Mercantile. Lorelei wrote that she was excited to finally be public with their relationship, that she couldn't wait to see my face when I realized what was happening. I opened our joint bank account on my phone with hands that had started shaking. Charges at jewelry stores I'd never visited, $18,000 at Shreve & Co., another $12,000 at Tiffany. Designer boutiques with purchases in sizes that weren't mine. Hotels in Los Angeles and Portland during weekends when Nathaniel claimed to be at conferences. Then I found the investment portfolios. The brokerage account that should have contained nearly $400,000 showed a balance of $83,000. Transaction history revealed careful, deliberate sales over 9 months, $15,000 here, $25,000 there, $30,000 the following week. Never enough to trigger alerts. Always just below the threshold that would make me look twice at a statement. The complete financial picture took 3 hours to assemble. Nathaniel had liquidated over $340,000 from accounts we'd built together, transferring the proceeds to accounts I didn't recognize. He'd been funding an entire parallel life while telling me we needed to be careful with spending. I drove to Cassandra's apartment without calling first. She opened the door in pajamas, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside. On her living room floor, I told her everything, the emails, the hotels, the money, the anniversary dinner planned as my public execution, my grandmother's pearls that Lorelei would probably be wearing. Cassandra didn't offer empty reassurances. She'd been through her own divorce 4 years earlier. She understood that some betrayals don't have explanations that matter, only consequences that need to be managed. When I finally stopped talking, she asked one question, "What do you want to do?" The grief was still there, sharp and overwhelming, but underneath it was clarity. I want to fight back. Cassandra picked up her phone. Then call Miranda Castellanos. She's the lawyer who handled my divorce. She doesn't lose. I met Miranda that afternoon in her corner office on Montgomery Street. I presented the facts without crying: the affair, the theft, the planned humiliation. Miranda took notes, asking questions about assets and documentation. When I finished, she set down her pen. I need to know something before we proceed, she said. Do you want a fair divorce settlement, or do you want to win completely? Both, I said without hesitation. Miranda smiled, sharp and certain. Tell me about your prenuptial agreement. I pulled up the PDF on my phone. Miranda scrolled through 47 pages with practiced speed. Halfway through, her expression shifted from professional interest to focused intensity. Does your husband remember what's in this prenup? I don't think he ever really read it. His father insisted on it. Nathaniel signed it because Edmund told him to. This prenup specifies that any business built primarily with funds from the Pemberton Trust remains your separate property. Your family's foundation provided seed funding for his firm, correct? $6 million. The trust took 40% equity in exchange. Miranda's smile widened. Victoria, your husband isn't just going to lose this divorce. He's going to lose his company. Miranda made 4 phone calls before I left her office that afternoon. The first was to a forensic accountant named Douglas Kirkland, who specialized in tracing hidden assets in high-net-worth divorces. The second was to a private investigator she described as thorough and discreet. The third was to someone she referred to only as her technology consultant, speaking in careful language that suggested the less I knew, the better. The fourth call was to her paralegal, requesting immediate retrieval of every document related to Hartwick Development Group from the Secretary of State's business database. She walked me to the elevator with a leather portfolio containing intake paperwork and a list of documents she needed: bank statements going back 3 years, tax returns, investment account statements, the complete prenuptial agreement, the original equity agreement between the Pemberton Trust and Nathaniel's firm, insurance policies, vehicle titles, the deed to our Pacific Heights house. Don't let him know you're gathering this information, Miranda said as the elevator doors opened. Don't change your behavior in any way that might alert him. You need to be exactly the wife he expects: trusting, accommodating, completely unaware that his world is about to collapse. Can you do that? I nodded, though I didn't know yet whether I could pull it off. I had to go home and pretend everything was normal while building the case that would destroy my husband. The performance had to be flawless because Nathaniel couldn't suspect anything until it was too late. Douglas Kirkland's office was in a modern building near the Embarcadero, all glass and steel with views of the ferry building. I met him 2 days later, carrying every financial document I'd gathered without arousing Nathaniel's suspicion. Douglas was in his mid-50s with the kind of laser focus that came from careers spent finding patterns other people missed. His office smelled like old coffee and the particular tension of detail-oriented work. Computer monitors covered every surface, displaying columns of numbers that apparently told Douglas complete stories about where money came from and where it went and who was lying. He reviewed my documents with careful efficiency, occasionally asking questions about specific accounts or transactions. After about an hour, he told me to go home and he'd call when he found something worth discussing. The way he said when, instead of if, suggested he already knew he would find evidence. It was just a matter of documenting it thoroughly enough to hold up in court. Douglas called me 4 days later. I told Nathaniel I had a dentist appointment and left the foundation early, my stomach in knots because I knew whatever Douglas had found would be worse than I'd imagined. I was right. Nathaniel hadn't just been liquidating our investments recklessly. He'd been moving money with precision designed to avoid detection, small sales that wouldn't trigger alerts. $15,000 on Monday, $25,000 on Thursday, $30,000 the following week. Adding up over 9 months to more than $340,000 that had disappeared into accounts I'd never known existed. But that wasn't the most significant thing Douglas found. He'd traced the equity structure of Hartwick Development Group through every round of financing and every shareholder agreement amendment since its founding. The Pemberton Trust's original $6 million investment had converted to 40% common equity 3 years ago, exactly as I'd remembered. But what I hadn't fully understood was what that meant legally under the terms of the prenuptial agreement Nathaniel had signed without reading carefully. According to the prenup's language, which Edmund Hartwick's lawyers had drafted with almost prophetic precision, any business entity in which my separate property held majority operational control or provided majority initial capitalization would be classified as my separate property, not subject to division in divorce. The Pemberton Trust hadn't just invested $6 million. It had provided the entire seed funding that made Hartwick Development Group possible. Nathaniel had contributed sweat equity and business plans, but zero capital. Does this mean what I think it means? I asked Douglas, hardly daring to believe it. It means that under California law and the specific terms of your prenuptial agreement, Hartwick Development Group is legally your separate property, Douglas said, his tone matter-of-fact despite the enormity. Your husband has been treating it as his company, but the equity structure and the prenup terms are clear. He owns 60% of a company that belongs to you. Douglas printed everything he'd found, evidence now 3 inches thick of financial betrayal and legal proof that the company Nathaniel considered his greatest achievement was actually mine under the law. Miranda had also hired James Porter, a former FBI agent who'd spent 20 years in white-collar crime before starting his own surveillance practice. James was in his late 40s with gray at his temples and the patient manner of someone who'd seen every variation of human betrayal. He followed Nathaniel and Lorelei for 2 weeks, documenting their affair with careful precision. The photographs he delivered were comprehensive and damning. Time-stamped images of them at the Fairmont using a corporate card. Dinners at Boulevard and Zuni Cafe where they fed each other dessert. Weekend trips to Tahoe where they kissed on the dock like they were starring in a romance instead of committing adultery funded by stolen money. James had captured Nathaniel's hand on Lorelei's face in that gesture men use when they want to appear tender. Photographs of them laughing in ways that hurt because Nathaniel hadn't laughed like that with me in over 2 years. Video of them in hotel lobbies, comfortable with each other in ways that proved this was established partnership, not momentary mistake. Miranda showed me every photograph. I forced myself to study each one, even though they felt like small knives. I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting against. Meanwhile, I had to return home each evening and perform the role of oblivious wife with absolute conviction. I cooked dinners. I asked about his day and listened to his lies with appropriate sympathy. I attended a fundraiser where Nathaniel gave a speech about sustainable development, standing beside him in a navy dress, smiling at clients and investors who treated me like an accessory. Lorelei was there too. I shook her hand and complimented the firm's success, watching her eyes for any guilt. I saw nothing except barely concealed satisfaction, the look of a woman who believed she'd won. I watched Nathaniel and Lorelei exchange glances across the room. Small looks that communicated entire conversations. Other people noticed too, colleagues who gave me sympathetic looks, investors who seemed uncomfortable. Garrett watched with amusement rather than disapproval. Our marriage had been a public joke for months while I'd been the only one who didn't know the punchline. 2 weeks before our anniversary, Nathaniel came home with unusual enthusiasm and announced he'd made reservations at Mercantile to celebrate. He wanted to invite close friends, Garrett and Simone definitely, his sister Vivian, maybe a couple others who'd been important to us. He smiled like he was planning something wonderful. My stomach turned to ice. I knew immediately what this dinner meant. Nathaniel wasn't planning a celebration. He was planning a performance with me as the unwitting star, designed to humiliate and destroy me publicly while validating whatever narrative he'd constructed about our failed marriage. That night, after Nathaniel fell asleep, I called Miranda from the bathroom with the shower running to cover my voice. She listened to my description of his plans and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said 3 words that changed everything: let him try. Miranda and I spent the next 2 weeks in daily strategy sessions, reviewing every piece of evidence Douglas and James had gathered. But Miranda's approach surprised me. She wasn't interested in creating a dramatic presentation or exposing the affair publicly. That would be satisfying, she said, but it's not strategic. Your husband is planning to humiliate you with an audience. We're going to do something more devastating. We're going to let him hand you exactly what you want, and then we're going to take everything he thinks is his. She explained her strategy with the precision of a chess master. I would attend the dinner. I would accept the divorce papers. I would sign them calmly without argument. And then, when Nathaniel believed he'd won, when he was celebrating with Lorelei and his friends, I would say exactly 5 sentences that Miranda had scripted with legal precision. You're not going to show evidence at the restaurant, Miranda said. You're going to let him think he's gotten away with everything. Then Monday morning, my office will file the divorce response along with a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent transfer of marital assets, and a motion to freeze all assets of Hartwick Development Group pending determination of ownership under the prenuptial agreement. She showed me documents she'd already prepared, a response to Nathaniel's anticipated divorce filing that laid out the complete case for why I owned 40% of his company and why that 40%, combined with the prenup's language about separate property, meant I had controlling interest in every major business decision. The lawsuit named Nathaniel personally and Hartwick Development Group as defendants, seeking damages for the $340,000 he'd stolen plus punitive damages. By the time he gets to his office Monday morning, Miranda continued, he'll find that the company's bank accounts are frozen, his signatory authority suspended pending court review, and every investor and client will have received notification that ownership is under dispute. His entire world will collapse in approximately 72 hours. The documents spread across Miranda's glass conference table represented complete devastation. This wasn't just winning a divorce, this was destroying everything Nathaniel had built. The company he'd spent 15 years growing. The reputation he'd cultivated. The future he'd planned with Lorelei that depended entirely on wealth and status he was about to lose. Is this too much? I asked quietly. I want justice, but I don't want to become someone cruel. Miranda looked at me directly. Victoria, your husband stole over $300,000 to fund an affair. He's planning to humiliate you publicly at a restaurant he specifically chose because it's where he proposed, turning one of your happiest memories into a weapon. He's demanding you give him half of everything, including property he has no legal right to, while he's already hidden assets without your knowledge. This isn't cruelty, this is consequences. She was right. But some part of me still whispered that destroying someone completely, even someone who deserved it, would change me permanently. Here's what I need you to do, Miranda said, pulling out a single index card with 5 sentences written in her precise handwriting. Memorize these exactly. Don't add anything. Don't elaborate. Just say these 5 sentences after you sign the papers, then leave. Can you do that? I took the card and read the sentences 3 times before I looked up and nodded. Over the next week, I practiced those sentences until they felt like muscle memory. I rehearsed the calm I would need to maintain while signing papers designed to humiliate me. I prepared myself for seeing Lorelei wearing my grandmother's pearls, the physical manifestation of everything Nathaniel had stolen. Miranda also prepared contingencies. If Nathaniel didn't bring divorce papers to the dinner, we'd file first thing Monday anyway. If he suspected something and backed out, we'd adjust. But Miranda believed Nathaniel's arrogance would carry him forward. Men who plan public humiliations rarely anticipate their targets might fight back. He thinks you're weak, Miranda said during one of our final preparation sessions. He thinks you'll cry and beg and make a scene that validates his narrative. He's betting everything on you being the woman he's convinced himself you are. That's his fatal mistake. 5 days before the anniversary dinner, Cassandra came to visit while Nathaniel was supposedly at the office. We sat on the terrace overlooking the bay with wine, watching sailboats move across water that looked almost silver in the late afternoon light. Cassandra looked at me with the directness that came from decades of friendship. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? She asked carefully. Once Miranda files those documents, there's no taking it back. Nathaniel will be destroyed publicly, and yes, he deserves it, but you'll have to live with being the person who did that. The weight of what I was planning settled on my shoulders. Part of me, the part that had loved Nathaniel 11 years ago when he proposed at Coit Tower, whispered that complete destruction was cruel regardless of what he'd done first. That I should handle this privately with dignity. That becoming the kind of person who destroyed someone else would change me irreversibly. But then I thought about Lorelei sitting beside Nathaniel at that dinner, probably wearing my grandmother's pearls. About Nathaniel laughing with friends while planning to serve me divorce papers as entertainment. About the $340,000 he'd taken while telling me we needed to be careful with spending. About the emails discussing their future and the company he'd built using my family's money. He invited friends to watch him humiliate me, I said quietly. He planned this dinner specifically to destroy me in front of people who would validate his narrative. I'm just responding with legal consequences he brought on himself by forgetting what he signed 10 years ago. Cassandra nodded slowly and squeezed my hand, but I saw concern in her eyes. I just want to make sure you've thought about the aftermath. Not just the legal aftermath, but the personal one. You'll have to live with this decision for the rest of your life. I didn't have a good answer because I hadn't thought much beyond Friday night and the moment when Nathaniel's planned humiliation would turn into his own destruction. I'd been so focused on building the case that I hadn't considered what kind of person I would be afterward. The night before our anniversary dinner, Nathaniel came home earlier than usual. He walked through the door carrying roses from Whole Foods, nothing expensive, but the gesture surprised me after months of cold distance. He kissed my cheek and said he was looking forward to tomorrow's celebration, that he'd planned something special to mark our decade together. The words were so perfectly calculated to sound genuine while meaning something entirely different. The last remnant of whatever affection I'd held for him turned into pure contempt. I thanked him and arranged the roses in a crystal vase while he showered, listening to him hum like a man without guilt or conscience. That night, we ate dinner together at our table overlooking the bay. Nathaniel talked about a difficult client meeting. I asked polite questions about the Foundation's latest grant cycle. We discussed whether we needed the deck refinished and what to do about the oak tree dropping branches. We performed the routine of a functional marriage with such skill that an outside observer would never guess that one of us was planning public humiliation while the other was planning complete financial devastation. I watched Nathaniel smile and talk and eat the salmon I'd prepared. How had I ever mistaken performance for genuine affection? How had I believed in this man enough to marry him and give him access to my family's resources? When he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room holding Miranda's index card. I read the 5 sentences one more time in the dim light, feeling something steady and certain settle in my chest. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and perfect temperatures. Nathaniel woke early and dressed in his Tom Ford suit, humming while he adjusted his tie like a man preparing for a celebration rather than a betrayal. I put on the emerald silk dress he'd once said made me look elegant, applied makeup with steady hands, and checked my phone for Miranda's text, "Everything is ready. Remember, just the 5 sentences, then leave." Before leaving for the Foundation, Nathaniel kissed my forehead and said he'd meet me at the restaurant at 8, that I shouldn't be late for our special evening. I watched him drive away and felt completely calm. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of absolute certainty. I spent the afternoon pretending to review housing grant proposals while running through the 5 sentences for the 100th time. At 6:30, I left the office and drove home to change. The house felt strange and hollow, like I was viewing it as something that belonged to my past. I arrived at Mercantile at exactly 8 o'clock. The restaurant looked the same as it had 11 years ago when Nathaniel proposed: crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, dark wood paneling designed to make diners feel sophisticated. I stood outside for a moment, taking one last deep breath before walking through doors that would close behind me on the life I'd been living. The hostess greeted me with professional warmth and guided me through the dining room without needing to ask where I was headed. Nathaniel had clearly made arrangements for maximum visibility. The table was large, positioned in the corner with clear sight lines from most of the restaurant. Nathaniel sat at the center like a man holding court, wearing his most expensive suit and an expression of barely contained satisfaction. Garrett occupied the seat to his right, expensive watch, tailored suit, confident posture. His wife Simone sat beside him, dripping in jewelry. Vivian already had her phone positioned, a glass of wine in her other hand. But the person who made my heart pound with fury sat directly beside Nathaniel. Lorelei Ashford wore a form-fitting black dress, and around her throat hung my grandmother's pearl earrings. The ones that had survived 4 generations. The ones that represented my family's history of resilience. She wore them like trophies, and when she saw me, her smile was pure satisfaction. I kept walking, keeping my face neutral, letting them see exactly what they expected, the confused wife walking into an ambush. As I approached, Nathaniel raised his champagne glass, his voice carrying across nearby tables. "I want to propose a toast," he announced. "To new chapters and to living authentically." The table erupted in rehearsed laughter. Garrett raised his glass with approval. Simone tittered like she was watching theater. Vivian adjusted her phone angle, making sure she captured everything. They'd practiced this, coordinated their responses for maximum impact. Nathaniel reached into his messenger bag and extracted a thick envelope embossed with a law firm's logo. He slid it across the white tablecloth with theatrical precision. "Happy anniversary, Victoria," he said, satisfaction thick in his voice. I picked up the envelope slowly, aware that 6 people were watching my face, waiting for tears or anger or desperate begging. Inside were divorce papers, already completed except for my signature. Yellow sticky notes marked where I needed to sign. I read through the documents carefully. Nathaniel was claiming no-fault divorce, requesting equal division of all assets including the Pacific Heights house. He wanted me to pay half of all marital debts. The papers requested I vacate our home within 30 days. He was even asking for spousal support. It was breathtaking audacity. And if I hadn't spent 3 weeks preparing with Miranda, I might have believed I had no choice. Instead, I pulled my pen from my clutch and began signing every page with steady hands. The silence at the table shifted from anticipation to confusion. This wasn't the script they'd written. The humiliated wife was supposed to cry or beg or demand explanations. She was supposed to create drama they could record and discuss later over drinks. I signed the first page. Then the second. The pen made soft scratching sounds against the paper that seemed loud in the growing quiet. Nathaniel's smile faltered slightly, just a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Garrett leaned forward, his expression shifting from amusement to something harder to read. Simone's hand paused halfway to her wine glass. Even Vivian lowered her phone slightly, confusion replacing the gleeful anticipation she'd worn when I arrived. I signed the 3rd page. The 4th. The 5th. Each signature deliberate and clear, my hand steady despite my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Around us, nearby diners had started to notice. Conversations at adjacent tables dropped to murmurs. A waiter paused mid-step, clearly sensing something significant unfolding but uncertain whether to interrupt. Page 6. Page 7. Lorelei's hand tightened on Nathaniel's arm, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into the expensive fabric of his suit. She leaned toward him and whispered something I couldn't hear, but his slight shake of his head suggested he was telling her everything was fine, everything was going according to plan. The 8th and final page. I signed my name with the same careful precision I'd used on all the others, then set down the pen. The sound of it hitting the table seemed to echo in the quiet that had fallen over our corner of the restaurant. I slid the papers back across the white tablecloth toward Nathaniel, the manila envelope making that same soft whisper against the linen. Then I looked directly at my husband, at the man I'd loved for 11 years, the man I'd supported and believed in and trusted with everything I had. "Thank you for making this so easy," I said, my voice steady and clear enough that the people at the next table could probably hear every word. "I accept these terms and look forward to our divorce being finalized quickly." Nathaniel's smile returned, broader now, almost triumphant. Garrett actually started to raise his glass again. Vivian lifted her phone back up, no doubt thinking she was about to capture the final moment of my humiliation. I took a breath and delivered the remaining 4 sentences Miranda had scripted with such precise legal language. "I should mention that my lawyer will be filing a response on Monday morning, along with documentation proving that under our prenuptial agreement, Hardwick Development Group is my separate property. You'll also be served with a lawsuit for fraudulent transfer of marital assets and breach of fiduciary duty. The company's accounts will be frozen pending court determination of ownership. Have a wonderful evening." The change in Nathaniel's face was immediate and total. The satisfaction drained away, replaced by confusion that quickly shifted towards something that looked like panic. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand, which had been reaching for his champagne glass, froze in midair. What? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. What are you talking about? I stood, smoothing the emerald dress with hands that were shaking now but only slightly. I placed my napkin on the table with deliberate care. Around us, I could feel every eye in the dining room turning toward our table. Garrett made a sharp sound, not quite a gasp, more like the noise someone makes when they've been punched in the stomach. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed back from the table. The prenup? His voice was urgent, directed at Nathaniel. What prenup? What is she talking about? Lorelei had released Nathaniel's arm and was staring at me with an expression that had shifted from satisfaction to confusion to the beginning of genuine fear. What does she mean, her separate property? Her voice had lost its earlier confidence, rising slightly at the end of the question. Vivian had lowered her phone entirely now, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting between Nathaniel and me like she was trying to understand what was happening. Nate, she said uncertainly. Nate, what is she saying? Nathaniel found his voice, though it came out louder than he probably intended, drawing even more attention from nearby tables. You can't, that's not, the prenup doesn't say that. You don't own my company. Actually, I said quietly, picking up my clutch from the table, I do. Or at least, 40% of it, which combined with the prenup's language about separate property built with family funds, gives me controlling interest. Your lawyer should have explained that before you planned this evening. You might want to call him tonight. I turned toward the exit. Behind me, chaos erupted at the table. Nathaniel's voice rose above the others. Victoria, wait. Wait. We need to talk about this. You can't just. Garrett was speaking urgently into his phone, having apparently called someone the moment I mentioned frozen accounts. I heard fragments, need you to review something immediately, prenup language, possible ownership dispute. Simone's carefully maintained composure had cracked entirely. Oh my God. Oh my God, Garrett, this affects you too. Your partners. What does this mean for? Vivian's voice cut through. Did you really not read the prenup? Nate, tell me you read what you signed. Tell me you knew what was in it. But it was Lorelei's voice that carried the most panic, sharp and rising. What about the waterfront project? What about the expansion plans? Nathaniel, what is she talking about, controlling interest? That's your company. You built it. She can't just take it. Tell me she can't take it. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I kept walking through Mercantile's dining room while other diners openly stared now, some with their phones out, clearly recording what was happening. The hostess stood near the entrance, her professional composure faltering, uncertain whether she should try to manage the situation or stay out of the way. I walked past her without making eye contact, pushed through the heavy wooden doors, and stepped into cool evening air that felt sharp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere inside. Through the restaurant's large windows, I could see Nathaniel standing now, his hands raised in some gesture that might have been pleading or explanation. Garrett had moved away from the table slightly, still on his phone, his free hand pressed against his forehead in the universal gesture of someone receiving very bad news. Simone had her hand over her mouth. Vivian was staring at her brother with an expression I couldn't quite read from this distance, but that looked like a mixture of shock and something that might have been disappointment. Lorelei remained seated, but her hand was at her throat now, touching my grandmother's pearls with fingers that looked like they were trembling even from where I stood. She said something to Nathaniel, and I saw him shake his head emphatically, saw the beginning of an argument that would probably continue long after they left the restaurant. Other diners at nearby tables had their phones out. I could see them typing, probably posting to social media about the scene they'd just witnessed. By morning, this would be all over San Francisco's social circles. By Monday, it would reach the business press. The valet brought my car within minutes, a young man who wouldn't meet my eyes, clearly aware something dramatic had occurred. I tipped him $20 and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, my hands gripping the steering wheel. My phone vibrated. Miranda's text, perfect execution. See you Monday morning at 9. Don't answer any calls from Nathaniel or his lawyers tonight. Another text from Cassandra. I don't know what you just did, but Nathaniel's sister is posting cryptic messages about karma. Call me when you're ready. I set the phone down and drove home through streets that looked exactly the same as they had 2 hours earlier. Traffic lights changed on schedule. Other cars moved with normal Friday evening urgency. Everything appeared normal, which felt absurd given that nothing would ever be normal again. I pulled into the driveway of the house Nathaniel and I had shared for 8 years. The windows were dark. The garden looked peaceful. Everything appeared unchanged, which felt impossible. I couldn't make myself go inside. I stayed in the dark car for 10 minutes, watching my hands shake with delayed reaction. The calm I'd maintained throughout the dinner had evaporated, replaced by shock mixed with disbelief that I'd actually done it. When I finally walked into the house, the silence felt heavier, more permanent. This was no longer the home I shared with my husband. It was just a house containing my possessions and memories of a marriage that had ended tonight in front of an audience. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, occasionally checking my phone to watch messages accumulate. Nathaniel called 17 times between 9 p.m. and 2 in the morning. I didn't answer. Each voicemail grew progressively more desperate. The first few were confused. What had I meant about the prenup? Could we talk like adults before involving lawyers unnecessarily? By midnight, the tone shifted to anger. How dare I embarrass him in front of his friends? I had no right to claim ownership of a business he'd built with 15 years of work. By 2 a.m., the messages shifted again to something approaching panic. He needed me to call back immediately. There must be some misunderstanding. Could we discuss this privately before anyone did anything irreversible? His voice cracked on that last message. Garrett left 3 messages, each more carefully worded than the last. He wanted to understand the situation clearly. Perhaps there had been some miscommunication about ownership structure. Could we arrange a meeting? The 3rd message mentioned his lawyers would be reviewing relevant documents. Vivian sent a long text around midnight that started with accusations of cruelty and ended with something almost approaching understanding. She'd had no idea about the affair, she claimed, an obvious lie given how quickly she'd started recording. But she'd looked up California prenup law after I left, and if what I'd said was true about the Pemberton Trust funding the company, then maybe Nathaniel had really screwed up this time. The message ended, I hope you know what you're doing because he's going to fight this with everything he has. Lorelei sent nothing, which felt more significant than all the other messages combined. Cassandra arrived at 7 Saturday morning with bagels and coffee, letting herself in with her key. She found me still in bed, fully dressed in the emerald dress, staring at my phone. Tell me everything, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. I told her about the 5 sentences. About walking out while Nathaniel stood there panicking. About the voicemails accumulating through the night. About lying here wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake or the smartest decision of my life. Cassandra listened, then said something I needed to hear. He spent 10 months planning to humiliate you publicly. He stole over $300,000. He forgot about a prenup that protects you. This isn't you being cruel, this is consequences. Saturday afternoon, Miranda called. Nathaniel's lawyer had already reached out requesting an emergency meeting. Nathaniel apparently wanted to negotiate before any lawsuits were filed, wanted to discuss reasonable terms that would avoid unnecessary litigation. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him that my client has no interest in negotiating when the law is clear. The prenuptial agreement speaks for itself. The equity structure speaks for itself. We'll be filing our response and lawsuit as planned Monday morning. He asked if you'd accept a settlement offer. I told him we're not interested in settling, we're interested in what you're legally entitled to, which is 40% of the company plus damages for fraudulently transferred assets. Miranda paused. How are you holding up, Victoria? I don't know yet, I answered honestly. Ask me again in a week. Monday morning, Miranda's office filed the divorce response and comprehensive lawsuit against Nathaniel and Hartwick Development Group. By noon, the company's bank accounts were frozen. By 3 p.m., Nathaniel had been served with papers at his office in front of his entire staff. By Tuesday morning, every investor and client had received formal notification that ownership structure was under legal dispute. Nathaniel's world collapsed in exactly the 72 hours Miranda had predicted. His signatory authority on accounts was suspended. The waterfront development project was put on hold. 3 senior staff members resigned within 48 hours. The business press picked up the story by Wednesday. Not the affair, that remained private, but the legal battle over ownership. Headlines read, Hardwick Development faces ownership dispute, Prenup throws developer's company into legal chaos, wife claims control of husband's real estate firm. Garrett formally dissolved his partnership with Nathaniel on Thursday, releasing a carefully worded statement about pursuing different directions. Everyone in San Francisco's development community understood exactly what it meant. 2 weeks after the anniversary dinner, I sat alone in my Pacific Heights house surrounded by everything I'd fought for, and felt completely empty. The legal victory was comprehensive. Miranda had been right about everything, the prenup was airtight, the equity structure was clear, Nathaniel had no defense. He would lose not just the divorce, but likely 40% of the company he'd considered his greatest achievement. I should have felt satisfied. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollowed out. Cassandra found me that evening in the dark living room, staring out at the bay without really seeing it. She didn't ask how I was, she just sat beside me in silence. You're wondering if you went too far, she said quietly. I destroyed him, I said. Completely. His company, his reputation, his future with Lorelei, all of it gone. And yes, he deserved consequences, but did he deserve this? Did he deserve to lose everything? Cassandra was quiet, then asked, what did he plan to do to you at that dinner? Humiliate me publicly while his friends watched and recorded it. And what did he do with your money? Stole over $300,000 to fund an affair. And what did he forget about? A prenup that protected me. Then you didn't destroy him, Victoria. He destroyed himself by being careless and cruel and so arrogant he forgot about legal protections his own father insisted on. You just let the consequences happen. I wanted to believe her. Part of me did. But another part whispered that there was a difference between justice and devastation, and I'd chosen devastation because it felt more satisfying. 3 weeks after the dinner, Nathaniel sent a letter through his lawyer requesting a settlement conference. He was willing to accept the prenup's terms regarding company ownership if I would agree not to pursue damages for the liquidated investments. He acknowledged making mistakes during our marriage and taking funds he shouldn't have accessed, but argued that punitive damages would serve no purpose except revenge. Miranda brought me the letter during a strategy session. It's your decision, she said. We can push forward with everything and probably bankrupt him, or we can accept the company ownership and let the financial fraud claims go. What do you want? I looked at the letter, at Nathaniel's lawyer's careful language trying to minimize systematic theft as mistakes. No settlement, I said firmly. He didn't offer me mercy when he was planning my public humiliation. He gets the full legal consequences of everything he did. Miranda nodded. Then we proceed with everything. The court proceedings took 6 months to fully resolve. Judge Margaret Thornton reviewed the prenuptial agreement, the equity structure, and the documented evidence of Nathaniel's financial fraud with an expression that grew increasingly severe. Her ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. The Pemberton Trust's 40% equity was confirmed as my separate property. Because the company had been built primarily with my family's capital, and because I held 40% equity, I was entitled to controlling interest in all major business decisions. Nathaniel retained his 60% equity ownership, but I controlled the company. Additionally, Judge Thornton ruled that Nathaniel owed me full restitution for the $340,000 plus interest and punitive damages, just over $500,000 total. The Pacific Heights house was awarded to me entirely. All retirement accounts became mine exclusively. Nathaniel was ordered to pay my legal fees, nearly $200,000. He was left with 60% equity in a company he no longer controlled, debts he couldn't pay, and a permanently damaged reputation. During one of the final hearings, I saw him across the courtroom. He looked diminished, thinner, older somehow, wearing an off-the-rack suit instead of his usual designer labels. When our eyes met briefly, I expected to feel satisfaction or vindication or something approaching victory. Instead, I felt nothing. Just a strange emptiness where all that rage and hurt had been. The court also ordered the return of my grandmother's pearl earrings. A bailiff delivered them to Miranda's office in an evidence bag. When I held them again after months of knowing Lorelei had worn them like trophies, I cried for the first time since discovering Nathaniel's betrayal. Not from sadness exactly, but from relief that something precious and irreplaceable had been recovered from the wreckage. I had them cleaned at a jeweler downtown who specialized in antique pieces. He examined them carefully under magnification, commenting on their quality and craftsmanship. When he handed them back, polished and restored, I put them on immediately. Looking at my reflection in his shop mirror, wearing the pearls that had survived 4 generations of Pemberton women, I saw my grandmother's defiant strength looking back at me. 1 year after that anniversary dinner at Mercantile, I stood in my home office overlooking the bay, wearing a silk blouse I'd bought for myself without considering whether anyone else would like it. The house was entirely mine now, not just legally, but emotionally. I'd redecorated every room to erase traces of Nathaniel's presence, replacing his preferences with mine. The master bedroom was painted soft gray instead of the bold navy Nathaniel had insisted would be sophisticated. Furniture we'd chosen together during optimistic early years had been sold or donated, replaced with pieces I selected alone. Artwork I'd been collecting quietly for years, stored in closets because Nathaniel found it too abstract, now hung throughout the house. The kitchen renovation I'd planned for 2 years while Nathaniel stole our savings was finally completed using money from the divorce settlement. New countertops in pale quartz. Updated appliances including the professional-grade range I'd wanted but Nathaniel claimed was excessive. A breakfast nook with windows overlooking the garden where I sat most mornings with coffee and silence. The transformation had been expensive, consuming a substantial portion of the settlement funds. But the cost was necessary for my survival in this space. I couldn't continue living in what felt like a museum of a failed marriage. I needed to create something new. Hartwick Development Group was operating under new management I'd appointed. The company was smaller now. Nathaniel's departure had caused some clients to leave, but it was stable and profitable and focused on projects I actually believed in. Affordable housing developments. Sustainable urban planning that served communities instead of extracting profit from them. The Pemberton Trust had recovered its investment and then some. My career managing the foundation had strengthened. Apparently standing up to betrayal publicly had earned me respect in philanthropic circles where people valued strength over accommodation. I joined a support group for people recovering from financial abuse in marriage. Thursday evenings in a church basement with folding chairs and donated coffee. Listening to others share stories similar to mine provided perspective I hadn't found in legal victories. These were people who'd been destroyed by partners they trusted and were now engaged in difficult work of rebuilding. I'd reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my marriage. Women I'd known before Nathaniel who had gradually disappeared from my life as I accommodated his social preferences. Rebuilding those friendships required acknowledging that I'd allowed important relationships to atrophy, accepting responsibility for choices I'd made. I'd started painting again, something I'd loved before marriage but abandoned because Nathaniel found it impractical. My studio was the room that had been Nathaniel's home office, the space where he'd probably written those emails to Lorelei. Now it held canvases and easels and the particular smell of oil paints and turpentine that I'd forgotten I loved. Cassandra had asked me a few months ago whether I regretted how completely I'd destroyed Nathaniel's life. I'd thought about it carefully before answering. He planned every detail of my public humiliation, I said. He invited an audience. He coordinated with his mistress and his friends to maximize my pain. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars while telling me we needed to budget carefully. He forgot about a prenup he signed because he was too arrogant to read what he was agreeing to. I didn't destroy him, I just reminded him that actions have consequences and that underestimating quiet women is expensive. The truth was more complicated than that, and I knew it. I'd chosen the most devastating legal path available. I could have negotiated a settlement that left Nathaniel with his company and his dignity while still protecting my interests. I could have taken the moral high ground. But Nathaniel had chosen the restaurant where he proposed for my public humiliation. He'd invited witnesses to validate his narrative. He'd planned to record my breakdown for entertainment. So I'd responded in kind, but with truth instead of lies. With legal consequences instead of manufactured drama. With the prenup he'd forgotten about because he'd been too confident that his brilliant wife would never think to use it against him. I walked to my window and looked out at the bay, at the city where I'd built a life that was truly mine now. The evening light turned the water golden, and sailboats moved across it like white birds. My phone buzzed with a text from Miranda. Lunch next week? Want to hear about your latest grant projects? Another from Cassandra. Wine night Thursday? I have news. My calendar showed a full week ahead: board meetings, site visits to affordable housing projects, my Thursday support group, Saturday painting class. I'd become someone different over this past year. Harder in some ways, more suspicious of easy trust, quicker to recognize deception, less willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. These changes felt like losses of innocence that couldn't be recovered. But I'd also become stronger. More certain of my own worth independent of someone else's validation. Less willing to accept treatment that diminished me. More capable of strategic thinking when facing challenges that required sustained effort rather than immediate emotional response. The revenge I'd taken on Nathaniel had been complete and public, and exactly what he'd planned for me turned back on its architect with interest. Whether that made me a better person was a question I'd stopped trying to answer because the framework itself seemed wrong. I'd done what I needed to survive. What I needed to reclaim power that had been stolen through systematic lies and financial fraud and casual cruelty designed to break me. Nathaniel had wanted to erase me from his story so he could start fresh with Lorelei and the company he thought belonged entirely to him. Instead, he'd written himself out of mine. I touched my grandmother's pearls at my throat, for generations of survival worn against my skin. My great-great-grandmother who brought them from England. My great-grandmother who wore them to her husband's funeral and built a business from nothing. My grandmother who wore them through her own divorce and emerged stronger. Now they were mine, recovered from someone who tried to steal not just jewelry, but my entire history of resilience. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't served cold or served publicly with dramatic presentations. The best revenge was living well with resources you'd protected, in a home you'd secured, with dignity you'd refused to surrender, wearing pearls that represented 4 generations of women who'd survived worse than faithless husbands. Nathaniel would remember that anniversary dinner for the rest of his life. Not as his moment of triumph, but as the moment he lost everything by forgetting what he'd signed and who he was dealing with. Every time he tried to make a business decision and remembered he needed my approval. Every time he saw a headline about the Pemberton Trust's latest philanthropic initiative. Every time he drove past the waterfront development project that had been put on hold because of frozen accounts and ownership disputes. He would remember the wife he'd underestimated. The prenup he'd signed without reading. The 5 sentences that collapsed his carefully constructed world in less than 30 seconds. That turned out to be satisfaction worth far more than any marriage had ever been. I set down my phone and turned back to the canvas I'd been working on. An abstract in blues and grays that somehow captured the bay outside my window without trying to represent it literally. The paint was still wet, the composition not quite finished, but full of possibility. Tomorrow I had a board meeting about expanding our affordable housing grants. Next week, a site visit to see one of the developments Hartwick Development Group was building under my direction, actual affordable units, not luxury condos disguised as community improvement. My life wasn't what I'd imagined when I married Nathaniel 11 years ago. It was smaller in some ways: no partner, no children, no shared dreams about growing old together. But it was entirely mine. Built on my terms. Protected by legal documents I actually read and understood. Funded by resources I controlled. And standing in my home office wearing my grandmother's pearls and looking out at the city I'd helped shape through a decade of foundation work, I realized I wouldn't trade this hard-won piece for anything I'd lost. Not even for the version of Nathaniel I'd fallen in love with at that charity gala 11 years ago. Because that version had never really existed, just a performance he'd maintained until it became inconvenient. This quiet evening in a house that was mine, with work that mattered and friendships I'd rebuilt and a future I'd create on my own terms. This was real. And real, I'd learned, was worth fighting for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.